to today's ASA webinar, Retainage Practice in the Construction Industry. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few points of protocol so that you get the most out of your webinar experience. Remember, you are listening to the webinar via a conference service. If you are disconnected, repeat the steps that were given to you by the GoToWebinar registration email. In order to reduce background noise, please be aware that all participant lines are muted throughout the webinar into the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, click on the raise hand and please type them in the Q&A panel located on the right-hand side of your screen under the Q&A tab. The presenter will respond to questions as they become available. If your question is not answered during the course of the presentation, it will be answered during the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. The presenter contact information is available in the last slide of the presentation. Please note that today's program is being recorded. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Dennis Bausman. Dr. Dennis Bausman has over 30 years experience in construction and construction education. Prior to his current position as a professor and endowed faculty chair in the Construction Science and Management Department at Clemson University, he was in large commercial contracting where he held the positions of Executive Vice President, Division Manager, Senior Project Manager, Superintendent, Assistant Superintendent, and Field Engineer over a 22-year career in the industry. His industry experience includes management responsibility for over 300 projects totaling in excess of $2 billion of construction with a project size ranging up to more than $120 million. His project experience includes commercial, healthcare, industrial, entertainment, and public construction. He has a personal knowledge and involvement with a variety of contracting formats, including lump sum, guaranteed maximum price, cost plus, design build, and construction management, and has an extensive experience with the practice of retainage. Dr. Bausman is a member of the board of the American Institute of Constructors and has been honored as a certified professional constructor. He is a member of the panel of arbitrators for the American Arbitration Association and the licensed general contractor in ACTA. Dr. Bausman has conducted numerous research projects relating to construction issues and has published and presented the results of his studies extensively. In addition, he has developed and taught various continuing education programs for construction companies and the National Center for Construction Education and Research. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Dennis Bausman.
Good afternoon, and at the outset, please let me thank you for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge a couple of people, Lonnie Hawley, who is the ED of ASA for Central Pennsylvania, Colette Nelson, who is your Chief Advocacy Officer, and frankly, without whose support and guidance, this study would never have been completed. And then lastly, the foundation of the American Subcontractors Association, which funded that original study. And the primary purpose was to expose the facts of retainage and hopefully help fight the battle that you all face to reduce or eliminate it. I'd also like to thank all of you that are sitting in on this webinar. I know your time's valuable. Some of you have been probably going since 5 or 6 o'clock this morning, so I'll try to keep my comments on target and hopefully move through here quickly. You've got my background. Essentially, I was a contractor for roughly 2 decades, and I've been in education now at Clemson University since the late 90s. So I have somewhat of a unique perspective, I think, relative to this topic. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a brief background on this particular subject. I won't belabor it, but I wanted to give you some perspective. If you have a deeper interest on where retainage originated, you can get the full report. I often tell people it's bedtime reading so you can go to sleep. Retainage, as you all know, is money you earn, but payments delayed till some time later, some later stage in the project. The practice was started actually in the 1840s in the United Kingdom with the railroad industry. During that period, there was a really strong demand and a lot of new entrants came into the business, which resulted in a lot of failures, and then proponents at the time felt they needed protection for overpayment, payment for defective work, and the continued solvency of the contractor. And at that time, they held, in some cases, over 20% for retainage. This practice spread to the U.S., where we've had continuing disagreements regarding its use. Proponents argue that it provides needed protection to ensure performance. Opponents say it places an unnecessary financial burden on those it's imposed upon. It serves as a source of interest-free cash for the owner. And with general contractors self-performing less, the burden typically is transferred to the subcontractor community. And in markets like today, with ever challenging competition and pressure on market or margins, it's placing an increased burden on the at-risk builders. There's been a lot of efforts to reduce or eliminate retainage, but as you well know, the industry is incredibly fragmented. No one firm has a dominating position, which makes it very difficult for any individual firm to initiate change. The result is that, for the most part, industry organizations such as ASA and ASC, AGC, and ABC, the alphabet soup here, have been primarily taking the lead on trying to initiate change. The early focus has been on public construction because of the concentration of construction spending in this segment. Approximately half of the non-residential construction market, the construction dollars that are spent in the non-residential market actually flow from government. So most of the efforts have been placed on state and federal ownership, state and federal sources. Currently, the federal government, the current federal acquisition regulation states that retainage should not be withheld without cause. Now, in practice, agency retainage policy varies, but the GSA, U.S. Department of Transportation, Department of Defense have zero retainage policies. And this trend in public works, and the trend for, I guess, since the 1980s in public work, has been to lower retainage and increase the use of alternate practices. If you look at the state policy and trends, the state DOT has somewhat mirrored the federal policy, the federal DOT, because of revenue sharing. And a good example to show you is in 1999, when the federal Department of Transportation moved to a zero retainage policy, only 7 states, or 15%, had zero retainage on DOT work. A decade later, 55% allowed zero retainage, and since then, a number of more states have moved to zero retainage on Department of Transportation work. More and more states are continuing to lower retained percentages, pass legislation regarding prompt pay, accept alternatives to standard practice, and target both public and private work. At the time of the study, there were 6 states that limited retainage on both public and private work to 5%. New Mexico generally prohibited retainage. New Jersey had 2% on public work, and 21 states at that time permitted the substitution of securities. Pennsylvania's policy, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, on public work was 10% until 50%, and then afterwards it shouldn't exceed 55% of the work. GSA work in the state is 6% till 50%, and then 3%. Department of Transportation work, Pennsylvania Department of Transportation work, like the federal, has 0% retainage. However, Pennsylvania, like a number of states, has no limit on retained, or no limit or specified retainage for private work, which I'm sure you all are continuing to work on. if you look at some of what the trade associations have done and how they've weighed in, over a decade ago, in 2002, AGC, ASA, and ASC in a joint, they took a joint position, and it stated that when possible, retainage should be eliminated or reduced. All three parties supported that position. It encouraged the use of alternatives. It stated that retainage should be the same for the general contractor and the subcontractor. And their position encouraged early release and interest-bearing accounts for retained funds. AGC at the time recommended that on both public and private work, no retainage should be withheld without cause from the general contractor when they're bonded, and correspondingly, no retainage should be withheld on the subcontractor if they're bonded. Moving forward to 2007, consensus docs were developed by approximately 23 associations and industry partners. Currently, these contracting instruments are endorsed by over 41 associations and industry partners. And their position in these contract documents are that after 50%, the owner shall withhold no additional retainage, and the owner may release retainage for work in early finishing trades. And in addition, substantial completion definition is more favorably defined as it relates to retainage. At the time of the study, 49 states had retainage statutes. 43 specified retainage percentages. 70% limited the retainage to 5% or less. Now, on public work, 47 states specify retainage and 6 more limit retainage to 5%. At the time of the study, 10 states specified a maximum retainage on private work, with 7 of them specifying retainage of 5% or less. At that time, 21 states permitted the substitution of securities, 16 required the payment of interest, and 3 allowed the substitution of bonds. However, most retainage statutes apply to public work. At the time of the study, only 9 had limitations on private work. Now 13 states limited. And there's certainly a long way to go, in particular in the private sector. However, there is a trend towards lower retained percentages and more favorable payment policies. Let me give you now a little bit of background on the research effort. It was an independent study sponsored by ASA, the American Subcontractors Association, their foundation. It had 3 primary objectives: to investigate retainage practice, in particular look at the percentage of retainage withheld and the use of retainage alternatives. It sought to identify the detriments and benefits of retainage, those as they were perceived by each member of the delivery process. It was to investigate the alternatives to standard practice, to determine support and opposition for each alternative and the effectiveness of their use. The targeted population was, to include in the study, was all the parties involved with project delivery. We wanted to get their perspective from owners, architects, construction managers, CM at risk, builders, general contractors, and subcontractors. Let's take a closer look. The sample of that we used, the targeted population, the owners, we actually included public owners, representatives from the Department of Transportation from each state, and representatives from the National Association of Facility Managers. From the private sector, we included the ENR's top listing of the top 500 owners in the U.S. for architects. We asked the E&R top 500, and then randomly chose 6 AIA members from each state. CM, we actually were able to utilize the entire CMAA membership listing. For general contractors, we included AGC's membership listing, those with a builder designation, realizing that road builders, paralleling the Fed, probably wouldn't have retainage on their work. For subcontractors, we solicited ASA's entire membership, which I think at the time was approximately, I don't know, 3 or 4, 5, 6,000. I forget, it's been a while back. In all, the population, the number of people that we solicited was over 10,000 for participation in the study. And actually, more than 1,000 participated, which was pretty good coverage. The survey was 87 questions. Some of them closed in. Closed in, all that means is that rather than giving an open answer, you can select a position. And for this study, we used a 7-point scale. So you could select 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And then some of the questions are open-ended, but like with most surveys, people don't tend to write much. But we did get a few comments back, or a number of comments back from some of the respondents. There were 2 parallel tracks to solicit participation. The Subcontractors Association and CMAA, we solicited and actually collected their input online. And then the remainder of the sample, we actually sent a hard copy to and let them either send back a hard copy or fill out an online survey. The survey itself had 5 general categories for input. One was current retention practices. There were 19 questions on that. Evaluation of retainage practices. We solicited their opinion on current practices, the benefits and the detriments relative to each. There were 34 questions on that. There were questions relative to assess the retainage abuse, the extent of abuse. There were 15 questions on that. We had 5 questions on the impact of retainage on project pricing and the impact on competition. And then there were 16 questions on alternate retainage practices. Let's take a look at some of the key findings from that research. This is a graph that shows you the retained percentages for various owners. And the 3 owners shown on this graph are federal, state, and private. And what you're seeing here is on the right-hand side, you'll notice roughly 2/3 of federal owners, at least 2/3 of the respondents to this survey, said they held 0 retainage. And federal owners, 20%, only 20% held 10%. Flip side is, if you look at the private owner, only 15% indicated they held 0 retainage, where 85% of private owners withheld 5% or more in their work. You can see that private owners typically held more than state owners, and state owners typically held more than federal owners. And that's evidenced by this next graph, which actually gives you an average retainage during the life of a project for the owners. And what you're seeing is on an average for federal work, you could expect to see owners are saying they average 3.3%, whereas private owners average somewhere around, retainage on private work average somewhere around 7.6%. And when we looked a little bit further, I didn't show you on this graph, that if you asked at-risk builders, both general contractors and subcontractors, the average held on general contractors was 7.3%, and the average held on subcontractors was 8.3%. If you look at the 5 categories, sorry, went the wrong way, excuse me. I asked, during the survey, we asked how many of CMs, GCs, and subcontractors had 10% retainage held at completion. And what you're seeing here is that at completion, 2/3 of the subcontractors participating in the study indicated that 10% retainage was held on the majority of their projects at completion versus roughly 1/3 of that amount for general contractors and CM at risk. In addition, we found that 85% of all participants had retainage of 5% or more greater at project completion. But you need to remember that these respondents were typically performing work in the private sector, so they weren't doing federal work, so you would expect these numbers to be higher. But I think the takeaway from this graph is that, right or wrong, subcontractors had a higher percentage of them had 10% retainage at the end of their contract than general contractors or CM at risk. We looked at the use of alternative practices for retainage, and the questions here allowed for a response of anywhere from 1 to 7. 1 was never use that practice or experience that practice. 2 was almost never, and then ranging up to 7, which was almost always. First was the substitution of financial instruments, securities, letter of credit, retention bonds, or payment performance bonds. The average response here was 1.5, which means the substitution of financial instruments was almost never used. For example, only 3.2% of the respondents said retainage was typically eliminated when they provided a bond. The next alternative practice was compensation or protection of retained funds. In other words, the payment of interest or escrow accounts. Again, the average response was incredibly low, 1.5%. It was, again, almost never used. In fact, 81% said they never were paid interest, and only 5.3% said they often utilized or had escrow accounts. We looked at early release of retainage, and this would involve line item release, retainage release, early completion of work, or release prior to occupancy. And here, this was sparingly used. It was seldom used. Only 10% of the respondents had a line item release. And then retainage limits, which would have put limits on subcontractor retainage. And again, only 15% of the project had limits on subcontractor retainage. The conclusion was that as it relates to alternative practices, they were almost never used. We also looked at the assessment of retainage practices, the perceived benefits from the owner and the builder perspective, the influence that retainage had on performance of the contractor and the subcontractor, the influence, if any, that retainage had on project relationships, and the financial impact that retainage had on the owner, the contractor, and the subcontractor, and then lastly, the fairness of retainage practice, how the practice was received by the parties. Let's take a look. First, regarding the benefits and detriments of retainage. For the most part, you're going to see as we go through this that owners and their agents, which for the sake of this study were architects and agency CMs, had similar opinions. And also at-risk builders, which included construction managers at risk, general contractors and subcontractors, again, often had very similar opinions relative to each other. Regarding the benefits and detriments, owners and their agents felt that retainage provided financial protection. It was not just a source of interest-free financing. And the owners were adamant here, as you might expect. They were neutral that it provided a buffer of overvaluation for payment, possibly in part because they think retainage encourages front-end loading. They believe that the use of retainage does not reduce competition for the project nor escalate price. This is a position that contradicts economic theory because they believe that financial protection they receive by withholding somebody else's money has no impact on that person, that party, or the price of their project. In contrast, builders at risk, which are CM at risk, GCs, and subcontractors, feel that retainage provides no financial protection. It does, in fact, encourage front-end loading. The practice reduces competition and escalates price of a project. And subcontractors firmly believe that the reason it is used is to provide interest-free dollars to the owners. In essence, the owner and their agents versus the at-risk builders are at two opposite ends of the spectrum regarding this particular point. The effect on competition and price, let's look at a little bit more detail. We asked 3 additional questions of the at-risk builders. First question was, would you be more likely to pursue a project if no retainage was withheld? What you're seeing here is the percentage of respondents that said yes. And almost, 85% of subcontractors said they were more likely to pursue a project if retainage was not withheld. The second question, would your price be lower if no retainage was withheld? And again, the majority of the at-risk builders said yes. When asked how much it would be lower, it ranged from 2.2% for general contractors to 3.6% for subcontractors. At-risk builders perceive financial protection for the owner has a price. It reduces competition and increases project cost. Now, these findings of this study were very similar to another ASA survey where if retainage was found that if retainage was not withheld, 91% of subcontractors were more likely to pursue the project. 69% of subs said they would lower their bid, an average of 3.1%. Very, very similar to what you're finding in this study. The influence on performance. Owners and their agents thought that it had marginal impact on performance and quality. They felt that it primarily encourages correction of defects, closeout documents, and punch list completion. They view retainage as leverage to close out a project as opposed to having a significant impact on performance during construction. Builders at risk have somewhat of an opposite position. They don't think it's an effective percentage for performance or to obtain quality work. However, GCs do believe it encourages correction of defects and receipt of closeout documents. Subcontractors, however, do not agree that it encourages correction of defects or expedites closeout. A little bit different opinion there. The impact on relationships. Owners and architects, they do not think it indicates the use of retainage. They don't think it indicates a lack of trust. They think it has no impact or effect on the alignment of project goals. However, federal owners, and it should be noted that they are the only party that has extensive experience with zero retainage, in large part because of DOT and DOD work. A majority of the federal respondents believe that the elimination of retainage had a favorable impact on project relationships. At-risk builders have somewhat the opposite viewpoint. They think that the use of retainage indicates a lack of trust and promotes adversarial relationships. And I'd like to point out that in years past, parties' trust in each other may not have been such a large issue, even though it certainly would rank right up there as a problem. But currently, in the current day market with compressed schedules, the growth of integrated project delivery for both CM at risk and design build, and owners' demands for increasing value, project relationships and effective project performance must be built on trust. So you actually have a situation here with retainage where at-risk builders think the opposite of what the parties actually need. Moving on, financial impact. In contrast, as noted earlier with sound economic theory, owners and their agents believe that retainage does not impact the builder's profit margin. They think that it does not increase their cost of doing business. They think it has no relationship with business failure, exerts no financial pressure on your firm, and that having your liquidity tied up in retainage or accounts receivable has no impact on your ability to take on additional work. Frankly, their position is difficult to support. It's truly in contrast with sound economic theory and financial management, but nonetheless, it's their opinion. As it relates to at-risk builders, they have the opposite opinion, as you might expect. You and general contractors and construction managers at risk believe it reduces profit, increases the risk of financial failure, imposes a severe financial burden, and or adversely impacts your ability to take on new work. However, I should point out that general contractors believe that reducing retainage, subcontractor retainage does increase, they feel it increases their risk. And limiting sub-retainage would discourage them from working with new subcontractors, subcontractors that they had no prior knowledge of, if they were unable to impose retainage practices or utilize retainage practices with them. As far as fairness, at-risk builders think the policy is fundamentally unfair. They claim it treats good performers the same as poor performers, and even architects view this as a negative for retainage policies. And because subcontractors perform most of the work, subcontractors typically bear most of the burden. As far as retainage abuse, the study also looked at three categories: the timeliness and full payment of retainage, the perceived owner abuse, and the perceived contractor abuse. Owners and agents believe that the owner pays timely and the full balance due on each and every project. However, they think that GCs, general contractors, use subcontractor retainage as leverage against subs. Owners think they do not abuse the use of retainage. However, interestingly enough, their agents believe retainage is often used by the owner to resolve claims or changes for work. We asked additional questions to evaluate the level of abuse and to quantify the extent of abuse. At-risk builders were asked, on what percentage of your projects do you receive 100% of your retainage? Typically, at-risk builders, as you can see here, only receive 100% of their retainage on 9 out of 10 projects, or roughly 90% of the time. At-risk builders are also asked to provide the number of days it took to collect final retainage. You can see here it took general contractors, it took an average of 99 days or 3 months. And the longest wait was average 365 days for general contractors and 620 days for CM at risk. For subcontractors, on the average, it took 167 days, or 5.5 months, after project completion to collect final retainage. In the longest cases, the average time took better than 1.5 years. Owners and their agents don't believe they abuse the use of retainage, yet at-risk builders experience these extended times for collection. Apparently, there is disagreement between the owner agents and at-risk builders on the definition of prompt pay and full pay. When the parties were asked if retainage abuse was a serious problem, at-risk builders and even agency CMs said it was a major concern. Subcontractors rated the seriousness of abuse at 6.8 on a 7-point scale. This is very similar to a previous ASA study where 92% of subcontractors said retainage was a serious problem facing their firm. Subcontractors believe contractors hold greater percentage on them than is being held on the GC, and retainage is used by the contractors as a lever for leverage over the subcontractor. And this is the view shared by most owners and their agents, that retainage is used as leverage by contractors. And all except owners believe that retainage is often used as leverage by owners. Lastly, we looked at some alternative retainage practices to determine receptiveness and support of various alternatives. Reducing and eliminating retainage. Owners and agents, they do not support the elimination or reduction to 2%. However, they do not oppose retainage reduction to 5%. Contractors, interestingly enough, support elimination of retainage on themselves, but did not support elimination on subcontractors. Only subcontractors and some federal governments support the elimination of retainage on subcontractors. The substitution of financial instruments. Owners and agents are opposed to the substitution of securities, retainage bonds, or letter of credit. At-risk builders are also not enthusiastic about swapping credit instruments but favor the substitution of bonds. As it relates to compensation for and protection of retained funds, for the payment of interest, owners don't support that, as you might guess. Their agents are neutral, and as you almost probably suspect, at-risk builders support the payment of interest. As it relates to escrow accounts, interestingly enough, owners don't oppose this. And owners, agents, and at-risk builders favor the use of escrow funds or escrow accounts. Early release of retainage, all support the release of retainage for early subcontractors on the project. And prompt pay, all support prompt pay legislation. Some additional suggestions that were received from respondents as we went through this study. Some, offered that we should select, the owner and the contractor should select quality team members to improve the quality. They indicated that the best alternative is to do their due diligence and only select quality contractors and subcontractors. And if that was done, retainage could be reduced or eliminated. As it relates to retainage incentives, they thought owners and contractors should establish retainage policy that provides performance incentives rather than universal punishment. They suggested that retainage be tied to the release. Retainage release be tied to performance, the reaching of performance goals and/or objectives. They suggested that they apply retainage for non-performance only withhold it for cause. Establish contractual remedies to withhold dollars for defective work. They thought we should allow contractors and owners should allow and require contractors to price retainage policy on each job, on each project. In other words, submit a price for no or lower retainage limits to verify or to see what impact that has on the price for that particular contractor or subcontractor. And then as it relates to retainage for project closeout, it was suggested in lieu of retained percentage, establish a retainage line item for project closeout. Withhold dollars from the last progress payment to cover closeout and provide incentive to complete the work. Essentially, you have two camps in the final analysis relative to retainage. Those that hold the retainage, the haves, and those on whom retainage is being held, the have-nots. The conclusions that are reached from this study is that retainage provides limited financial protection, primarily because it encourages overbilling. It has minimal influence on performance during construction. Primarily, it's viewed as leverage for project closeout. You know, and interestingly, as a result, that may be better achieved by withholding funds for closeout rather than making it a percentage. It reduces competition, it raises price, and also adversely impacts project relationships. It's limited protection that has a price, both monetarily and on the relationship of the parties. Some additional conclusions reached by this study were that abuse is widely perceived. It's widely received as being abused by owners and contractors. Owners and contractors use retainage as leverage for change orders, claims, and final settlement. On only 90% of the project do builders get paid full retainage, and typically it takes 3 to 6 months to receive the final payment. However, on a positive note, the percentage for retainage is trending down. Alternatives, while not widely accepted, but their use is increasing. Federal agencies have lower retention policies, some with 0. And states are continuing to address retained percentages at both the public and private sector. This study found support for line item release for early subcontractors, support for legislation on prompt pay and limits on retainage. It identified that the parties did not oppose reducing retainage to 5%. Owners' agents support escrow funds, and the owners don't oppose that. Owners' agents also do not oppose the payment of interest on retained funds, and there's evidence that the elimination of retainage improves relationships. But as most of you well know, many owners still need to be convinced that limited or no retainage may be in their best interest. If you want to see a copy of the complete report, the complete study, it's about 35 pages. So, unless you're not going to sleep or want to use it to get tired and go to sleep, you may not want to read it. But it is available at ASA's website, and does give you a little bit more background on the history and of retainage, and a little bit more insight into and depth on the findings of this particular study. And with that, I'll throw it open if there are any questions out there, comments, thoughts relative to the study, or maybe current practice.
Any questions, anyone? Raise your hand or type it in. Last call for questions.
I guess I put everybody to sleep, huh, Tony?
Or you didn't know. You did such a good job.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
again, thank you, Dr. Bausman, for your presentation, and it was very, very informative. And thank everyone for their participation today, and you all have a good evening.
Thank you.